Today in the EU, how are Chinese exports putting Germany's top industries on collision course? China's aggressive industrial strategy, which has China flooding global markets with heavily subsidized exports, is increasingly placing it on a collision course with Germany's leading export-driven sectors. With experts warning that the practice threatens the viability of Germany's economy, particularly in the automotive and industrial sectors, Euractiv looks at how this would affect the German and even the EU economy. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. To look into this, we're joined by Jonathan Packroff, Euractiv's Berlin-based reporter on economy and transport. Jonathan, you've been looking into the reasons why China may be in a direct collision course with Germany. Could you lay down the background story for us, and what have you found so far?
Yes, so over the last months, we quite often heard this term of Chinese overcapacity, right? On different occasions, the EU has looked into this issue of electric vehicles from China, where they say Chinese competition is unfair to an extent because China is actually subsidizing the electric vehicle manufacturing, giving it an advantage over European manufacturers, which it proposed to react to by imposing tariffs on China. Other issues are, for instance, solar panels, where there has also been kind of this discussion and kind of a warning by EU manufacturers that they cannot compete with Chinese competition, and they say it's because China is actually selling solar panels below production costs by subsidizing them onto the European market, essentially dumping them onto the European market, and therefore, also being in unfair competition with European manufacturers. So we have seen this issue for different sectors. So we looked into how this might affect Germany as the EU's largest economy, obviously.
And you're mentioning tariffs. Maybe you can remind to our listeners what is that we're talking about.
Yeah, so if you remember this case on the electric vehicles, there was an investigation done by the European Commission.
Indeed, in June, the Vice President of the European Commission, Margaritis Chinas, presented some of the findings of this investigation.
Today at the College, Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis presented to the College the provisional results of the ongoing investigation into the battery electric vehicles value chain in China. In particular, this value chain benefits from unfair subsidiarization, which is causing a threat of economic injury to EU battery electric vehicles producers. On this basis, the Commission has reached out to the Chinese authorities to discuss these findings and explore possible ways for resolving the issues identified. The Commission has also pre-disclosed today the level of provisional countervailing duties it would impose on imports of battery electric vehicles from China,
which claim that China is actually subsidizing its industries, its electric vehicle manufacturing, and therefore flooding, as they called it, world markets with electric cars, including Europe, and kind of being in unfair competition with EU manufacturers, which are the huge car manufacturers who are also shifting more and more from combustion engine cars to electric cars, but then they say this actually harms this transition because you have this new competition coming from China.
Why is this important for Germany and to an extent for Europe as well?
Yeah, so Germany has been in quite a problematic economic situation for a few years now. So of course it was hit very hard by the energy crisis, by the increase in energy prices due to the war in Ukraine. And And now that this issue of energy prices has more or less gone away, it has still very low growth. So people are increasingly looking into the more structural factors on why Germany is actually performing so bad. And one of the issues that is often looked at is the issue of exports, because Germany has in Germany, the export industry is very important compared to other large economies like France and Italy. Germany has a much bigger export sector. And if that is weak, then of course the whole country has a problem. So essentially, the question has come to for why is the German export sector performing not as good as it was in the years before?
Yes, exactly.
The COVID and energy crisis, and one of the reasons that could be it is the increased competition from China.
You're mentioning the term overcapacity. What does this mean in this case? And I know that you've been talking to many experts about this. What did they say, and what impact does it have?
Yeah, so actually, that's exactly the key issue of the debate, I would say. So what we've seen is that China has a lot of exports, and it's increasing its exports in industries where Germany is particularly strong, or has been particularly strong over the last decades. So that we looked specifically at cars, obviously, and then the second biggest one is machineries, and the third biggest is chemical industries. So there's a lot of discussion of what overcapacity actually means. And essentially what a lot of people say is that China has these huge production capacities, but they are only viable because it subsidizes them massively. So essentially, if you wouldn't have the capacities, then the factories would need to close. But China keeps them alive by subsidizing them, and therefore has now to export a lot of goods, because otherwise the products are just standing around. So they are now selling them at other markets and at other export markets to a lower price to kind of keep factories running which are not viable. And then yeah, so essentially it's a bit tricky, because over capacity usually you would measure by the utilization rate of a factory. So essentially, if a factory does not run, then it's not utilized fully. If it's, for instance, produces only half of what it could actually produce, say only the half of the amount of cars, then you would have a clear overcapacity. But then again, it is also claimed that China keeps these factories running. So then actually you wouldn't see it in these numbers specifically, but you would say it can only keep them running because it subsidizes them so heavily. And then these kind of surplus that you create in products that you cannot sell on the domestic Chinese markets, you would then sell to other markets in the world. And this is then only possible because of very low subsidies, and then is also competing maybe on unfair terms, so to speak, because yeah, you can sell them cheaper than actually the production costs are.
Now, to understand this a little bit better, what are the key differences between German and Chinese manufacturing practices in relation to market demand and subsidization?
Yeah, so for instance, I spoke to the German Machinery Maker Association, and they have a very clear view on this. They say actually the difference is that German industries, German machinery makers, they also export a lot. They have an export rate of sometimes 80%. So they produce also mainly for export markets. But the difference is they say we have customers around the world who are buying these products, and they are not subsidized by the state, so by the German government in that case. Whereas in China, the exports are only kind of a response to this overproduction, which is kept alive by subsidies, and then they are going to global markets. And what data from VDMA, from this Machinery Maker Association, shows is that China has actually massively increased its exports, in its global exports in machinery. So from 2000, where it had only 3% of global exports in machinery making, it has increased its market share to 18% in 2022. And this happened while German exports were declining in that sector. So there you already see this competition, or this problem that happens for the German industries.
Now, this indeed sounds like a problem for the German economy that could potentially have an impact on EU's economy as well. In this case, why did the European Commission lower its proposed tariffs on China-made electric vehicles just a week ago?
Yeah, so I mean, the electric vehicle case is one specific example of how the EU can react to these kind of overcapacity problems. And in this particular case, they said they actually looked into the data again, because there were some complaints about how they were measured, and there were some mistakes actually in what they measured. So they slightly amended the actual tariff rates, but still they haven't reached a final decision on whether they will impose these tariffs or not. Because if you remember, it was still a preliminary decision only to have these tariffs imposed, and it's still outstanding to take a final decision on that case. So the negotiations with China are ongoing, and we could interpret it as a signal to China that actually they still want to find a solution, which the EU says needs to address this issue of overcapacity, issue of subsidization, which is very difficult because it's such a core issue for the Chinese industrial policy. But it can be interpreted as a signal that they still want to kind of find a common solution, which would be beneficial for both sides.
And, Europe has been trying to de-risk from China for a long time now, and the US has had a more strict stance towards China. Has Europe's stance been influenced by the US, or does Europe follow its own path? And what can we expect on this if Donald Trump wins the elections in November?
Yeah, so I mean, the European approach has been quite different from the US, I would say, because the EU, for instance, on this case of electric vehicles, they really try to stay within the rules of the WTO. So they have done this investigation showing what subsidies happened, and then only applied the rate that is according to the kind of trade distortion.
It is for China to propose a solution that is WTO compatible and that addresses the issues and subsidies, illegal subsidies as we see them, that the European Commission has identified in its painstaking evidence-based investigations.
Said on this Olaf Gill, spokesperson for the European Commission.
Whereas the US has applied blunt tariffs of 100% on Chinese electric vehicles. So it has taken a much harsher stance, even under Joe Biden. And this has already potentially led to some trade diversions from China to Europe then as well. For instance, in the case of solar panels, it is said that it was also because the US has increased its tariffs on Chinese solar panels that then China has increasingly exported them to Europe instead of the US. So then in Europe, this problem became even bigger, if you want to call it a problem, of course, because Europe got cheaper solar panels. So that might also be good for Europe, of course. But from the view of the European solar industry, it was an even bigger problem. And that was because the US did something which Europe wasn't willing to do, which is imposing additional tariffs on solar panels. So essentially, yeah, Europe is a bit between these two blocks. And of course, if now Donald Trump would increase tariffs even more or take an even harsher stance, then you might expect this phenomenon to also affect other sectors. But as I said, even Joe Biden took this stance. And then there's another difference between, I would say, these two candidates that are now running for US president, which is that Trump really wants to impose tariffs on all imports. He wants to impose a 10% tariff on all imports. This would, of course, also affect German exports to the US. Otherwise, if the US wants to import less from China, this might also help German exporters, for instance, in machineries. If they import less machinery from China, then they might even buy more machines from Germany. So that might also help Germany. But of course, it's very difficult to estimate the exact outcome because there's a lot of diversion and you don't really know where then the products would be sold if they cannot be sold anymore to the US.
Then I guess we will have to wait and see who wins the US elections in November. Is it going to be Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? We will see.
Indeed.
Thank you for breaking this down for us, Jonathan. I am Evgiori, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Jada Santana and me. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.